And this is incredible. So excited for you all. Yes. What an awesome front door to the community and a chance to show people the love of Jesus. So glad to be here, glad to get to see the space, glad to get to share with you in this series. Let me start here. One of my heroes, my entire adult life, was a man by the name of Eugene Peterson. Some of you might recognize the name. And despite the fact that he was a very simple man, he was neither dynamic or overly impressive. He spent most of his adult life preaching to one small congregation. A lot of folks, myself included, were captivated by his writing. He was the author of some 30-odd books. Some of you might have he translated The Message, which is kind of a modern paraphrase of Scripture. And what I loved about him was just his tone of voice. He pushed all of us, especially those of us in ministry, to not minimize the small and simple work of just loving God, serving him faithfully wherever we're at. We live in a world that is captivated by charisma, by drawing large crowds, and Peterson seemed to present this beautiful alternative that has ended up defining so much of my life in ministry. Now, I share this because at his funeral service, his son gave a part of the eulogy where he stood up and said, "My father fooled all of you for decades worth of ministry and in all of his writing because he really only had one message that he just kept repackaging creatively over and over and over again." His son said he was let in on this early in his life. It's something that his father had whispered into his heart for 50 years. Words that he remembered his dad sneaking into his room at night, woke him up and would say over him. This one message was simply this: God loves you. He is on your side. He is coming after you. He is relentless. Now, I love that because I think it is a perfect summary of everything that we read in Scripture. God is for us. God is for you. God is for all of his creation. And for those of us who claim to follow him, it is that message that we have been tasked with proclaiming and embodying tangibly for the world around us. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that we are Christ's ambassadors. We're his representation to a tired and weary and broken world. Yet sadly, as Ben pointed out earlier, Calvin pointed this out last week, for good or for bad, that's not the message that we're known for. So oftentimes, the church is known for what we're against rather than what we're for. And so I'm so thankful that Beacon seems to circle back to this sermon series on the regular to remind us what it really means to be for, what it looks like for us to embody tangibly in our everyday, ordinary lives this message. Now, this morning, I've been tasked to give one piece of that and talk, what does it look like to be a church that is for the oppressed? And that text that we heard read earlier, I think, is a great and perfect place for us to unpack practically what that means. A real-life example from the early church where they are there for the marginalized and for the overlooked. Now, to give you some background, I don't know where you're coming into this from, but the book of Acts is just a book that tells and gives an account of the beginnings or the origins of what we call the church. And if we would have had the time this morning to have read the first 5 chapters of the book of Acts, we would have seen that so far, things have been going pretty well for the church. They have been facing persecution, yes, at the hands of some of their Jewish brethren who are not excited that they have started to follow Jesus as the Messiah. But besides that, we know thousands have come to follow Jesus and join the church. We read in Acts 2 and Acts 4 that they have everything in common, that they're showing hospitality to one another, they're feeding one another, they're doing life together. They have so much in common that they're even selling their possessions to make sure no one has need among them. It's almost like a utopia. And then we turn the corner into Acts chapter 6, and the very first problem, the very first fracture starts to emerge, and it all centers around a few widows that have been marginalized, that are being oppressed. Now, next week, Calvin's going to be talking about what it looks like to be there for the brokenhearted, and he's going to be talking about being there for the lonely, for those who have dealt with loss, for widows, yes. So there's a little bit of overlap, but in this case, they're not just brokenhearted, they are actually being marginalized. Because in the first century, to be a widow would have meant that you ended up at the bottom rung of society. In a patriarchal society, one that was very agrarian, you would have been at the bottom of society. You would have been incredibly vulnerable. Now, in Jewish life, they'd already made accounts for this. If you read the Old Testament, there are a lot of passages that talk about being there for the poor and for the orphan and for the widow and for the foreigner. There's a lot of language around this, and so Jewish life had made account for this. There was actually a feeding program in Jerusalem at the hands of the temple officials that would have overseen all of this. But here in Acts chapter 6, we find out that there are some Hellenistic or Greek-speaking widows that are being neglected, unlike the Aramaic-speaking Jews. So the vast majority of Jews within the life of Jerusalem would have been Aramaic-speaking. Obviously, because of diaspora, other people had come to follow Yahweh around the Mediterranean area, including some Greek-speaking folks. Some of these widows have ended up in Jerusalem, and they're not being fed properly. Now, we don't know why this is the case. We don't know if some of the Jewish officials they're the ones in charge of this feeding program, if they're just neglecting them based on their culture, or based off of like, hey, we have a food shortage, we're going to take care of our own first before others of a different ethnicity, a different culture. Or, which is also a real thing, if the Jewish feeding program didn't include Christians. They'd already been persecuting them. If they're like, if you follow Jesus, you're not a part of this thing anymore. And if the church was having to take care of itself with its own feeding programs, its own dispersion of food to care for the poor, and that the church had actually been not taking account for these Hellenistic or Greek-speaking women. Regardless, they're being marginalized, they're being oppressed, and the church's response in this moment, I think, teaches us a lot in our own cultural moment of what it looks like to be there for the oppressed. In fact, there's three things this morning that I want you to get from this text that we just heard read earlier that I think is going to teach us a lot. And the first is this, that a church that is for the oppressed listens. Listens. Look back with me at the first part of the text. It says, now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12 summoned the full number of disciples in response. Now, to connect the dots of what's happening here, the church is still very organic at this stage. There are these 12 kind of what we call the apostles. They're kind of leading. They'd been following Jesus for 3 years. They had watched him. They had heard all of his messages. They're kind of helping get this thing off the ground. And so I think it'd be easy to read it and think of them as like a city council that's like sitting behind their podiums, and the church just shows up, and like an open mic at a city council meeting, people are just coming and bringing their complaints. That's not what's happening at all. This is something much more organic. There is clearly someone who has been doing life alongside these women, who have cared for them, who have lived as faithful presence to them. They have heard this complaint. They have felt this complaint, and they are passing it on. And the entire church community is clearly listening. They're taking this seriously, so much so that the leaders kind of at the center of this movement gather the entire church together to listen and hear out this complaint that is going on. You see, so much of the work that is taking place here in just a few short verses is all surrounding around a church that has learned how to listen, how to be with, and to care about what they're actually hearing. Now, this might seem like a small thing, but it's actually a huge thing. Because if there's one thing that I have noticed from being in the church my entire life, and now serving in churches my entire adult life, and I get this because, by the way, this is my personality, is we like doing stuff. We're really good at we just want to do. And I think a lot of this comes from a really good place, right? We hear that we need to serve. We need to hear that we need to care for people. We want to evangelize. Our hearts are in the right places. And so we just start saying, what can I solve? What can we get on the calendar? Where can I volunteer? What project day can we put on the calendar, get and rally a bunch of people, and we're going to feel really accomplished, like we did something. All wonderful things. But we need to do a little bit better job of being and listening. Our hearts are in the right places, but often we go after short-term impact rather than long-term restoration and renewal of the people that are on the margins of our culture, the oppressed and the marginalized that are going to need relationships. They're going to need relational equity. They're going to need holistic care, mind, body, spirit, to truly seek the kind of renewal that we're after. Now, I'm sensitive to this because I live in a neighborhood that is incredibly blue-collar and diverse. We have a lot of felt need that is going on in our community. A lot of social services, a lot of nonprofits have risen up because of that. And my neighborhood, though, ironically, is surrounded by a bunch of other neighborhoods that are all the richest zip codes in my entire state. And it's not that uncommon that someone from a group from one of those other neighborhoods or zip codes, or sometimes a church, will show up and do a service project in my neighborhood. Or they'll come occasionally, like every other month or something, and serve at one of the nonprofits. I'm thankful they're doing that, by the way. But when they get done, they get in their cars and they drive back to where they live. There's no relationship. In fact, many of them, if you really press them, probably don't even want the people that they're serving to actually live in their neighborhood. They're not for affordable housing or care for these kind of people. They're coming to serve, they have a great short-term impact, and then they kind of leave. I think sometimes we're kind of guilty of the same thing. We feel good, we feel like we've accomplished something, but we're missing something, I think, a little bit deeper that we can do. Compare that to, there's another group in our neighborhood that practices the ministry of presence among the unhoused. We have a big unhoused population. And so what I really love, it's really beautiful, they started this open leadership circle of the unhoused. They actually met for several years in the basement of our coffee shop, giving agency to the unhoused, allowing them to build relationships, to voice what's actually going on in their life, and to say, this is what we actually need. And it was so illuminating to me because I realized I made a lot of assumptions about the homeless in my neighborhood, a lot of assumptions about what they needed and what was going to look like to get them back on their feet. And hearing it was like, oh man, there's some things that I thought you needed that you don't need, and there's some things I never would have dreamed that you need that you actually do. In fact, I love it. One of the ladies that's at the center of this, she's so great at bringing up people's personhood and humanity. I told her, I noticed as walking to work that there was a sleeping bag that had started to emerge in the bushes next to a building at the end of my street that I hadn't seen there before. And I said, do you know who this is? I'd love to reach out and care for them. And she said, actually, I don't. She said, I know who used to sleep there, but he passed away a couple of years ago. I want to know as well who this person is. And I kid you not, the very next day, I come walking back from work, and there sits a pot of flowers on the sleeping bag with a note from her, with her contact info, reaching out and saying, I want to know you. I want to hear your story. I want to listen. By the way, they're actually leading the state in getting people off the streets and into affordable housing, any other organization. There's a reason why. You know why? Because they listen. If we're going to do this, as a church, by the way, our hearts might be in the right place, but we have to do more than event planning. We have to do more than just giving some financial gifts. We need to actually do life in proximity and with presence to the people around us where God has placed us so that we can hear them. We give agency to them. We value their humanity. And so that's the question I want to ask you first this morning. Like, how well do you know the people actually around you in your life? A great starting place would be, by the way, Beacon. How well do you know the people in your faith community? I'm guessing there's a lot of socioeconomic disparity in this community. There's probably a lot of people that have need. How well do you know the people that you worship beside? Are you listening? What about your community? What about your neighborhood? I'm guessing there's people that sometimes maybe you don't want to be by when you're in line at Dunkin' or at the gas station, or that you drive by. How well do you know their story? It's not enough just to want to serve them. What it will take for us to begin to listen, because that is where we're going to get into the really good work of changing lives. So the first thing that we need to do, if we're going to be a church that is for the oppressed, is we're going to have to listen. But there's a second thing that I want us to understand this morning from this text, is that a church that is for the oppressed takes injustice seriously. Takes injustice seriously. Look back with me again at the first part of verse 2. It says, and the 12 summoned the full number of disciples. That might not seem like a big deal to you, but it should. After they've listened and heard, this gets their attention, so much so that they gather the entire church together to say, we got to do something about this, people. We got to figure this out together. And it would have been so easy for them to have been dismissive, right? be like, you know what? We've got people selling their possessions to give to the poor. There's a lot of good work going on. We don't need this negative energy. Let's just keep focusing on the good things that we're doing. Doesn't matter. Or they could have been, defensive, right? It's always those Hellenists. They're always complaining. They're always acting like we're holding them down. Nobody was there for us when we had need. But they just need to kind of pull it together. But they don't do any one of those things. They take it very seriously, wanting to bring change. They choose to not try to find some out so that they can choose passivity. And there's a major lesson that we too can learn from this, that when we hear of things, that we stop and we take it seriously. Now, I could spend a lot of time on this, but let me just point out one thing. And it's a little bit sticky, but let me just point out one thing. There's a Dutch social psychologist by the name of Geert Hofstede. I just love getting to say his name, so I always like working him in. But he did decades worth of research on different cultures around the world, ranking them on what he called his cultural dimension scale, and one of them was on individualism. And so it probably doesn't surprise you that the United States ranked number 1 in the world in individualism. We have an ethos, right, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. That's the American dream, right? That we believe anyone has a chance to make a better life for themselves. As an entrepreneur, I'm thankful for a lot of that. We also know here in New England, we probably live this out to the extreme, right? We love being fiercely independent and self-sufficient. That's the mantra of New Hampshire, live free or die. Lots of wonderful things come from this, by the way. But there's, like anything, there's a downside as well that we should own as Christians, right? That in our individualism and with the opportunities that are afforded us in our culture, it's really easy to choose dismissiveness or defensiveness. It's really easy, and I've been there. I'm the first one to confess this. It's easy to when someone's dealing with hardship, to be dismissive and to find some reason why they are in the situation that they're at. And to justify it. I know I shouldn't do it. They had the same opportunities I did. Why haven't they figured it out? Why haven't they gotten it together? The reason they are where they are is because of their life choices. And we just dismiss it. Not, is that fair? But that's what we say sometimes. Or we get defensive. We'll say things like, well, no one was there when I was in need. I've been through some pretty hard times, and I found my way out of it, and I worked hard, and I made something of myself. In fact, the financial statistics actually back this out. When philanthropic data is done or charitable giving research is done, the 6 states of New England rank at the very end of the entire United States. Our fierce independence streak sometimes comes with a little bit of a caveat. And we need to remind ourselves that we shouldn't choose dismissiveness or defensiveness, but we should choose to take this seriously. Friends, the early church wasn't just trying to do good things. They weren't just trying to do something because it made them feel good or the optics of it. They were doing this because they were Jesus people, and this is what Jesus had lived and done and preached. One of the most overlooked passages in all of the Gospels is how Jesus actually announced his ministry. He stands up in his hometown and he unrolls a scroll in Luke chapter 4 and he reads from the prophet Isaiah, and this is what he says. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's how Jesus announced his ministry. That's what he lived. We see him embodying this in so many different ways. And as Jesus people, they realize he is after the restoration and renewal of all of his creation. He wants it all to be made right again. All the things that sin has affected, he wants it made right. And we too are after those same causes. And even more importantly, and maybe some of you are already tracking with me and getting there, we know the early church had had their lives changed by the gospel, what Jesus had done, which is why they were following Jesus and listening to these things in the first place. Jesus had met them when they were broken, when they were sinful, when they could do nothing for themselves. The way of Jesus is not a meritocracy. He meets us when we can do nothing to get to him, and he meets us with love and care and says, I am for you. We know that too. That's our story as well, right? Thank be to God that grace is not bestowed only for those who have it together. So how in the world can we not allow this to reorient our lives from the inside out, that every single time that we look around at the brokenness of our creation, when injustice is happening with a fellow person made in the image of God is not all that they could be, as all that God designed, how can we not do something about it and live our lives for that, right? So first, a church who wants to be for the oppressed listens. Secondarily, they take injustice seriously. But thirdly, and I think this is where the rubber's going to hit the road for us here and get really practical, a church for the oppressed distributes leadership accordingly. I'm not going to go back and read, for the sake of time, all those other verses. But as you saw earlier, the apostles assemble them together, right? They begin to say, hey, this is a problem. We need to solve it. We're not going to solve it personally. It's not right for us to give up the ministry of word and prayer, but we are going to give this back to you. We think you need to select from yourselves some folks who can lead this new food care program for these Hellenistic widows, for these women. They start to realize that the answer to solving this issue is not hoarding leadership or responsibility, but giving it to everyone. Now, I want to clarify, because some people get real tripped up with the apostles, these leaders in the early church response, as like, are these fellas just like above it? Like they don't want to get their hands dirty? I've actually heard some preachers use this as a reason why they can just sit and write sermons all day and not do anything else. That's not what's going on here in the text at all. In fact, we should just own that at this point, again, these 12 men had spent 3 years with Jesus. The New Testament's not even written. They're writing it. They're embodying the message. They're passing on what they experienced firsthand. It's pretty important that they do that, by the way. But I think there's some other practical reasons that I think they began to realize. I think the apostles, it dawned on them like, yeah, we can take this one on for the church, but if we do, guess what? The next time a problem arises, we're probably going to have to take on that one. And then the next time a problem arises after that, we'll take on that one, and the one after that, and the one after that. And suddenly, this movement that God inaugurated, that he wants to be in all places everywhere, saturated with his presence, we've stunted it because we've hoarded it because we have to hold on to power and authority and leadership. We need to release it. We have to pass on some other people. And again, I think sometimes, especially in our culture where there's paid ministers, there's paid clergy, sometimes it's easy to default to this. I've heard people come up to me in a church lobby or send me an email and say, hey, I noticed this problem. Someone should do something about this. And the tone's always like, I don't want to do anything about it, but you should do something about it. That's not how the church works. I love the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, he says this, and he being God, gave us, the church, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and the teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ until we all attain the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of Christ, so that we reach maturity and to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. What this is saying is that some of these vocations, some of these callings kind of at the center of the church are not there to do ministry. They are there to equip and empower the entire church to do the work of ministry. It's not about a select few. It is about everyone taking on some of the responsibility. 1 Peter 2:9 says that we are a priesthood of all believers, not just a few. I think the apostles realized this in this text, but more than that, even if they could have handled this, even if they did have the bandwidth, even if they thought this was within their purview, they end up giving it back to the community because I think they realized they weren't the best people to solve this issue anyway. Now, it's not something you probably picked up when we read the text. It's probably not something you would pick up in your Bible study because it's something you might not be acutely aware of. But the people select from themselves 7 men to kind of run this new food care program and care for these women. And the amazing thing is all 7 of them have Greek Hellenistic names, not Aramaic speaking names. How amazing, right? The church looked and said, these are probably men that already have relationships with these women. They understand their culture and their heritage. They understand the struggles that they're going through. The church needs to release power from a select few and empower some people of another culture to actually lead in this, because we are not the best ones to lead. We don't know what's going on. I think this is so beautiful, right? There's an author by the name of Brian Sims who compares this to jazz music. If you've ever been to a jazz club, I love going to jazz clubs. A lot of my vinyl collection is jazz. And anytime you listen to jazz, there's kind of a given chord progression that all the musicians are playing before one of them, typically in the band, gets a chance to solo and kind of expands upon and exaggerates the melody that everybody else is playing and kind of gets a chance to star. And they all are kind of responding back and forth to whoever is kind of taking lead at that moment. And Brian says, this is a perfect example of what the church should do. Leadership is not just one person soloing and everybody else playing backup. It's wherever I have gifts or talents, or wherever God has placed me and I've got relationships and already have equity, I need to be leading the church in that regard, and everyone else needs to be following me. And you have this awesome, like back and forth, dialogical relationship of leadership that's happening in the life of the church. Friends, there are way too many things that we need to tackle as the church. Oppression and marginalization is massive. If we're going to meet it head on, it's going to take all of us, not just a few of us, and it's going to imagine us rethinking leadership. So 3 things for this text. If we're going to be for the oppressed as the church, we're going to have to listen. We're going to have to take seriously the things that we hear, and then we're going to have to distribute leadership throughout the church so that we can respond accordingly. Let me bring this all together for you really quickly and just give you a real life example. I've been coaching people to do this now for 7 or 8 years as a part of our church. And I realize that a lot of people, you might be thinking this right now, Drew, this all sounds really good, but I'm already tired. I'm stressed out. I got too much going on as it is. I can't imagine taking on anything else. And you know why? Because mission and being for the oppressed has been not packaged to us the right way as something that needs to be local and embodied. Far too many of us are doing something and are living in a way that God never designed us to live. We are living translocally with a digital focus on everything that's happening everywhere else except where we actually are. From the moment we wake up, our phones ding, and we get inundated with messages about the next global crisis. We doom scroll messages of people telling us of all the things that we need to be informed about, all the things that we need to stand on, all the things we need to rally around from a national or a global level. And I'm not advocating for us to have our heads in the sand, but our neurological systems were not designed for that, friends. God did not design us to have the omnipresence that only He is willing and can handle, not us, right? So the best thing that we can do, and this is what I'm advocating for, is the best thing that we can do is to put our phones away, spend less time focused on things where we have no influence or impact, and to start to say, God, where do you already have me in my life? That's not an accident. The street you've placed me on, the neighborhood that I'm in, the community that I'm a part of, the people that I work with, the people that I run into in my day-to-day life, those people matter. That's my ministry. And so I'm going to give more of myself there. I'm going to pour in. I'm going to lean close. I'm going to have proximity. I'm going to have presence. I'm going to build trust. I'm going to have relationships. I'm going to listen. And as I build up that equity, and as I hear of something going on, I realize this isn't something for me to pass the buck on. This is my ministry. This is the thing I'm going to take on. I can't change the world, but I can change this person's life. I can change my street. I can change my neighborhood. I can tackle that issue in my community. And I might have to rally a few Beacon friends around me to help take it on, but we can do it together. And then 6 months later, when someone else in the Beacon community has been doing the same thing, they've reordered around local, they care for the people nearest to them, they're listening, and they hear of something, and they're like, that's my ministry too. I can take that on. I'm going to rally a few Beacon friends around me. We can take it on together. What should be taking place in the life of Beacon is a bunch of people, hundreds of different stories of people reclaiming their everyday, ordinary life and saying, I will draw near to the broken, to the oppressed, to the marginalized, to the people in pain right there. I'm going to build trust with them. I'm going to build relationships with them. I'm going to hear them. And I'm going to take seriously what's going on. I can handle that. And together, you know what? I really think collectively we can change the world. Not individually, but collectively, all of us together can be the church the way God designed us to be. Let me pray for you. God, thank you so much that when we were in our sin, we could do nothing for ourselves, you cared for us deeply. You drew near. God, I pray out of our inspiration of that we would draw near to the pain, to the brokenness, to the oppression, to the marginalization that we see around us. God, may we never choose passivity. God, help us be right where our feet are planted. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear where you are at work and where you are beckoning us to let your kingdom come and your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. We pray all this in your name. Amen.